The British people are about to have practiced upon them a trick even cruder and more shameless than that by which they were cheated out of their inheritance of parliamentary self-government in the first place when we acceded to the European Economic Community. However, since the trick is basically the same one over again, it is to be hoped that the people will not be taken in twice, but will listen to those who warned them correctly before. When the proposal that Britain should join the common market was put forward in 1971 and 72, and again when at the referendum it was proposed that British membership should be confirmed, the public were told, officially and solemnly by the political parties, that the British Parliament would lose none of its effective power. British ministers, it was said, could always veto whatever appeared to them to be contrary to British national interests. They dare not agree to anything that Parliament disapproved. Those who warned that the first step was being taken towards the political unification of Western Europe and the degrading of the United Kingdom to the status of a European province were laughed to scorn. They were told that any such development, if it ever took place, would be many years, perhaps generations, in the future. The referendum had not been over for 6 months before the government and the political parties were singing a different tune. The veto, it appeared, was more often a veto in reverse, a veto which others could use against what we wanted or proposed, but which we could not use to protect ourselves against what we did not want. A classic example is fishing, where unless the rules of a community are changed, the fleets of all the other members will be able to fish right up to our beaches. We cannot veto this because it's in the treaty, which the Conservative government signed and the Labour government failed to renegotiate. It is the status quo. But any change in it that we want, such as an exclusive 50-mile zone for our fishermen, can be vetoed out of hand by any of the members, even by landlocked Luxembourg. Month after month, we have had ministers coming to the House of Commons and declaring themselves opposed to community policies. Why, they positively encourage the House of Commons to vote against those policies. Then they go off to Brussels, and presently they come back, having agreed to those very policies, wringing their hands and saying, "We don't like this any more than you do, but we had to accept it because it was part of a package." Now, of all silly sayings, one of the silliest is the saying, "You can't put the clock back." Of course you can put the clock back, and you often do. If a clock is showing the wrong time, you put it back or forward, whichever is necessary, without the slightest hesitation. So in human life, and in a nation's life, if a mistake has been made, we ought to put it right, if we can. Some mistakes, especially in an individual's life, are irreversible. And there may, though more rarely, be such in the life of a nation. But we ought always to be on our guard against those who tell us so, who whisper in our ear, "It's done now, and it can't be undone." For those are commonly the voices of cowardice or indolence, and sometimes of downright evil intent. Certainly the mistake which Britain made in giving up her parliamentary self-government and national independence to become a part of the European Economic Community is not irreversible. One would suppose it was, And that is what you are intended to suppose. To listen to the chorus of politicians and newspaper editors who keep chanting like an incantation, "You're in the market now. The referendum's over. You've got to live with it now and make the best of it, whether it was right or wrong, and whether you like it or not." Most of them must know, and all of them ought to know, that that is not true. Whenever it is repeated, it is the repetition of a falsehood, conscious or not. That can be proved, and conclusively and irrefutably proved in an instant. The government itself, when in 1975 it proposed to the electorate that they should answer yes at the referendum, stated clearly and without qualification in the official declaration that after the referendum, if a majority was for staying in, the continued membership of Britain would still depend on the continuing assent of Parliament. Our charter is enshrined in the very words of the government's own referendum statement. The British Parliament retains the final right to repeal the act which took us into the market. Thus our continuing membership will depend on the continuing assent of Parliament. No room there for the suggestion that now the referendum's over, it's all settled. No. The government's solemn assurance is that the question is not settled and remains at all times open. Nor is there any room for arguing that we are bound, either morally or legally, to a decision once taken. If that were so, there could be no talk about the continuing assent of Parliament. Parliament would have to be told, "You're bound now and cannot and must not break your word." Nothing of that. Parliament, which is to say the electorate who create parliaments, is as free at any moment to withdraw its assent, either to British membership as such, or to anything argued to be implicit in British membership, as it is to alter the standard rate of income tax, roll on the day, or to repeal the 50-mile-an-hour speed limit, and roll on that day too. I have quoted the law to you. The formal legal position, as the government have officially affirmed it. But it would be disingenuous to pretend that there is not a higher law according to which no nation can be bound against its will to the surrender and renunciation of its freedom, independence, and sovereign identity. The right to nationhood is one of those rights of which it may be said that time does not run against it. It is not yet known whether the Scottish nation will decide by a majority to resume the status which they relinquished in 1707. But if they do, I would like to hear their reply to those who would tell them that they could not do it because of a treaty of union. History is littered, and some of its most glorious pages are adorned with the instances of nations which reasserted and reclaimed their right to govern themselves and live under their own laws and policies, not after 5 or 10 years of eclipse, but after centuries. It is bitterly ironical that an Englishman of all people should need to argue the point at all to his countrymen, seeing that, historically, we have made the cause of nations rightly struggling to be free our own cause. In doing so, we have been deterred by no superstitious awe before the title deeds of tyrannies or empires. There is no superior jurisprudence which can ever say to a nation, "You shall not, or you shall no longer be the masters of your own fate." I doubt indeed whether any nation can ever be brought to renounce its own self-mastery except it was deceived, except by means of trickery and cheating. Certainly it was by deception that Britain was hijacked into the European Community in 1972. It was by deception that it was induced to give retrospective assent to the hijacking at the referendum in 1975. And it is by deception that the hijackers are now engaged in obtaining a further stage of Britain's amalgamation into the new West European state by a new and far-reaching transfer of authority. Parliament is shortly going to be invited to authorise the direct representation of the electorate of the United Kingdom in a Parliament of the EEC. The government claimed to have discovered that we are morally and legally bound to do this in accordance with the Treaty of Rome, to which we acceded by the Treaty of Brussels in 1972. Now, it's a most extraordinary thing and highly convenient for the hijackers that this discovery remained unmade, or at any rate unannounced, not merely until after the exhaustive debates in 1972, when the European Communities Bill was forced through the House of Commons by means of the guillotine and the grace of a handful of Liberal MPs, but until after the referendum in 1975. Was it not extraordinary that no one should have happened to mention to those who might have been considering voting yes, that thereby, incidentally, they were approving the principle of a directly elected European Parliament? It was indeed. But what is more remarkable is that the government were at pains to declare that the question of direct elections was outside the referendum altogether. It almost defies belief that direct elections to the European Assembly were not mentioned at all in the document which the government addressed to the electorate at the referendum. Many of us, of course, did at that time warn the electorate that a yes vote meant commitment to a European Parliament, which would supersede and override our own. But if we had dared to say that in the event of a yes vote, such a thing would be agreed to within a year, we should not merely have been pooh-poohed as alarmists with extravagant imaginations. We should have been accused of downright lying. Had not the government itself, in the White Paper, Report on Renegotiation, made it clear that the issue of direct elections did not arise and was not involved in the referendum? Here's the passage. It was made absolutely clear by the United Kingdom that Her Majesty's government could not take up a position on the proposal for direct elections to the European Assembly by universal suffrage before the process of renegotiation had been completed and the results of renegotiation submitted to the British people. How could the government say in March 1975 that they could not yet take up a position on direct elections, and then claim after June, 3 months later, that direct elections had always been implicit in the treaty and that everybody should have known it all along? It was a piece of electoral deception worthy to put alongside the Conservative parties "Our commitment is to negotiate no less, no more" at the 1970 election. What it turns out the government were really doing was to tell their European colleagues that until after the referendum they didn't intend to reveal to the British people that those who voted yes were voting for a directly elected European Parliament, because that would have blown to the winds the claim of some pro-marketeers that no real diminution of national independence and self-government was involved. Of course it was. Of course it is. Does anyone seriously imagine that the Parliament of this country will for long be allowed to debate matters which have already been debated and approved in a directly elected Parliament of EEC? Our own national Parliament at Westminster will soon be told to mind its own little local difficulties and not meddle in the affairs of a community, which are the business of those directly elected by the same electors for that very purpose. It is true that at present the formal powers of a European Assembly are limited, though they do include the power of almost nuclear dimensions to dismiss the European Commission itself or to reject the community's entire draft budget. What is true, however, is that those powers can at any time be extended by amendment of a treaty, and that under Section 1 of the Act of 1972, that would require no more than a single vote of the House of Commons, taken after a debate which need last no more than 90 minutes. It is true that Parliament, and through Parliament the electorate, have still the power to refuse to accept direct elections. But the same soft soap is being used again as in 1972 and 1975. On the one hand, we shall be assured that it's only direct elections to the present Assembly, with its present limited powers which are at issue. There are no proposals for increasing those powers, so why worry? The argument will run. It won't be for a long time ahead, if ever, that the directly elected Assembly becomes a real Parliament with real powers, and that will only happen in the fullness of time if we agree to it of our own free will. On the other hand, we shall be told that it would be bad faith to reject an undertaking to the other member states into which the government have entered, and that in any case direct elections were always envisaged by the Rome Treaty to which we have acceded. This is false, and I will prove it to be so, and I will prove that the government themselves know it to be so. Once again, the British nation is to be induced by trickery to sign away its birthright. Let me read to you the words in the Treaty of Rome, which, so the government claimed to be convinced, create an obligation upon member states to set up a directly elected European Parliament. The article which lays down the procedure begins as follows. The Assembly shall draw up proposals for elections by direct universal suffrage in accordance with a uniform procedure in all member states. Now, this has nothing whatsoever to do with what the government are proposing to stampede Parliament and the country into accepting. The attempt to cite the Treaty of Rome as committing this country to what the government propose is a barefaced piece of deception. The treaty does not refer to any old proposals for direct elections. It refers to elections by direct universal suffrage in accordance with a uniform procedure in all member states. Any proposals which do not provide for a uniform procedure in all member states do not comply with the treaty, and the attempt to use the treaty to commend or enforce them is not even a withered fig leaf to cover the nakedness of usurpation. Be under no misapprehension that that is what is involved in the issue of direct elections, and that it is fully intended by those who will strain every nerve to bring direct elections about. There cannot be coordinate authority between two sets of persons representing the same electorate. What the one gains, the other must lose, and the gain will be to the body which has the larger claim. Already, Parliament in 1972 has conceded to the community the right to legislate and tax and determine policy over the head and behind the back of the House of Commons. Already, so the judges have told us, the law of a community prevails over the law of the United Kingdom in case of conflict. The sphere within which these competencies are exercised by the community can at any time and any stage be enlarged by no more than one debate and a single vote in Parliament. Can anyone but a fool seriously suppose that if the community, already thus equipped, is endowed with the authority derived from a body which directly represents the total electorate, the elective bodies of the member states will not shrink and shrivel under the spreading shade of a European Parliament, Commission and Council. To that, increasingly, our ministers and governments will look, and not to the provincial assembly, which our once all-powerful House of Commons will have become. It would be equally a mistake to suppose that this result will be unintended. I had the privilege, if so it be, in a select committee, as it happened, in the last session of Parliament, to hear one of the warmest advocates of British membership of the EEC hail as a great consideration in its favour the fact that the Parliament and the electorate of the United Kingdom would be prevented from what he called doing silly things by having surrendered the power to legislate independently and being subjected to the laws and policies of the European state. That, starkly, is the difference between a nation and a province, between self-government and subordination, between self-respect and self-contempt. The choice between them, still open, still free, in no wise morally or legally preempted, is the choice your representatives will shortly be making in Parliament. You still have the power to punish them if you take it otherwise than as you wish, but you must tell them, and tell them now. No politician can restore to a nation a spirit which is lost, or a pride and personality which have departed from it. What politicians can do, if that spirit still exists, and that pride and personality are merely latent and not extinct, is to show the nation when the time to exert itself has arrived, and when the opportunity is present. The coming months, until the threat of a super parliament of a European state is averted, will be such a time.